Thanks for joining me today. I'm incredibly excited because it's book launch day. So if you haven't already purchased a copy, my latest book, Parent the Child You Have, Not the Child You Were, is officially out and available for sale today. If you purchased a pre-sale order, thank you so much for doing that, and I hope that you can leave a review on Amazon. But if you haven't yet purchased one, the link is right here. So run on over to either Pessy or Amazon and pick up your copy today. So I am here actually just to kind of do a Q&A with you guys about the book, about any parenting questions that you might have. So feel free to write them in the chat box. We did have actually a few questions come in already, so I'm happy to address those, and we'll just kind of spend some time together getting to know the book a little bit more and getting to know me as the author. So again, my name is Dr. Bree Turns, and I'm excited to have you with me today. So the first question that came in was, how did you come up with the title? It really resonates with me. I have received this feedback a lot over the past couple months. I've been working on this book for over 2 years with my amazing publishers. And really, kind of the title started about 5 years ago. I see clients through a private practice, and I work with a lot of children. I mean, that's my main clientele. And every time I was working with a parent, we would discuss why they were making the parenting decisions they were making, where it was coming from. And the responses I commonly received were, well, this worked for me as a kid. Or, hey, my parents did this and I hated it. And so I intentionally do the opposite of how I was raised. So I was vacuuming one day and I was, just processing certain clients that I had that week. And the title just clicked in my head was they weren't parenting the child that they had, they were parenting the child that they were, which at face value doesn't sound terrible, but it can actually be really damaging for kids. And so what's been really helpful in how this book kind of came to fruition was walking parents through this process of how do you heal from your inner stuff? Maybe it's trauma, maybe it's not. But then how do you heal from it so you can actually physically see the child in front of you, your child, and the needs that they have? And so, awesome question. But yep, that's really how the title came to fruition for me. So I do hope that it resonates with you. A lot of people laugh and they say, wow, that title gets me. And my common response is, yeah, I don't wait till chapter 2 to kind of cut into you. I do it from the cover of the book. So I'm hoping that it's helpful for a lot of you out there. So the second question that we had come in was, how can we set healthy, realistic intentions or expectations for parenting? I think if there was one simple answer to this question, and if I were to give it to you, I would be a billionaire, because I don't know if there is any one specific way of setting healthy, realistic expectations. I do want all of my parents to know, and I really start off the book hard with this idea of not shaming yourself and not, guilting yourself because you're going to make mistakes and you probably have already made mistakes. And that can be really hard for parents to kind of grapple with and not continue to beat themselves up with, especially when you're laying in bed at nighttime, just running through the day of all the decisions that you made and saying, here's how I failed my kids, here's how I failed my spouse. And that's nothing that I want, parents to feel throughout the day. And so some small tips that I actually provide for how we can set healthy, realistic intentions and expectations is first to know that you're going to get it wrong. And sometimes that really happens, and it can be really challenging. But I think a great intention or an expectation is to focus on what are the characteristics and the values that you want your children to catch from you. There's that old phrase of more is caught than taught. So for example, you might want to teach your child, I really want you to be trustworthy. I really want you to be honest. And what can be hard is if you consistently tell your child to do these things, but you don't model it, there's an inconsistency in your parenting. So I think really being consistent in that, and just being really, thoughtful of what morals and values and, characteristics do I want my child to pick up on can be a really good way to start setting up those initial intentions. And we just had a great question come in. So, what are unhealthy generational patterns do you see most often in clients? Oh, such a good question. So, there's quite a few, but I will be honest, it's hard for me not to get on a soapbox about this one. But spanking. Spanking tends to be a really big one. And oftentimes, when I ask parents, well, how come we're spanking? The immediate response is, well, I was spanked. And so it feels like, well, this is the only way to discipline or parent our children. And so spanking has been passed down from centuries, I think. And where it came from, I don't really know, because to be honest with you, all the research has pointed to if you're physically hurting your child in order to get them to obey, they're actually more inclined to hurt other people physically in the future. So that's actually one unhealthy generational pattern that I see. Another one, I guess there's quite a few that are coming to mind. Some of them can be really unhealthy coping mechanisms. So, for example, things like being a workaholic, someone who doesn't take breaks, someone who just works 7 days a week, which I'm kind of calling myself out here a little bit on this one. That can be kind of an unhealthy generational pattern that your kids will then pick up on. And your kids don't realize, oh gosh, I really need to rest. I really need to take a break and just simmer down. Some other generational patterns I commonly see is frequently, so spanking's a big one. Maybe just the expectation that emotions are a bad thing. So oftentimes what I'll hear from parents is, I don't want my child to be angry because the anger makes a lot of discomfort in themselves. And so whenever their child shows anger, they get very, very uncomfortable with it. And they say, well, don't be angry. Like, you can't be angry. And really, anger is totally okay and it's an acceptable emotion, but because it makes the parent uncomfortable. So we then have a lot of generations of people who won't share their emotions or who overly share their emotions and feelings because they're not heard and we're not really being able to process, well, what's underneath that anger. And so that's a great question. I really appreciate you asking that. But yeah, it's there's quite a few, unhealthy generational patterns. So yeah, thanks for that question. So the next question that we had come in was, I didn't consider my childhood to be traumatic, but I'd still like to improve my parenting style. Is this book for me? It 100% is. There are some small components in the book in which I do discuss trauma because a lot of people have experienced traumatic, negative events. And personally and professionally, I actually define the term trauma as anything that caused you to not feel safe emotionally, physically, or spiritually. So with that, when your brain doesn't feel safe, it can have a very maladaptive way of coping and of processing. And so maybe you are defining trauma as big car accidents, or you're defining it as sexual abuse or physical abuse. And even if you didn't experience something like that, let's say that you experienced being socially isolated when you did something bad, and your parents consistently put you in your room and said, well, when you choose to behave, then you can come out. That might not be defined as trauma for some people, but it can actually really continue to shape how you parent. Because then maybe your initial reaction when your child starts to, show undesirable behaviors is, well, you go into your room because I can't handle you. And if you can't handle them as a parent, then let's just isolate them. And that can still cause you to be parenting the child that you were. On the flip side of that, because I want to try and play both sides of this, I do get parents who will often tell children and they parent the exact opposite of how they were parented. So maybe instead of being put in timeout, maybe what ends up happening is the parent actually has the child come out and they sit and they overly kind of discuss the situation and what happened. And to be honest with you, I've seen some of my parents, for lack of a better phrase, kind of beat the situation to death of talking to the child about, okay, what happened and what are your feelings and what's going on. And doing that, let's say for a 5-year-old, their mental capacity to be able to have this conversation is maybe 4 or 5 minutes. Some of my parents were doing this for over a half an hour. So then what's happening is the child is then like, okay, the situation's done and over with. I'm ready to go play, but the parent can't let it go. Again, because they're parenting the child that they were. And they think like, oh, well, I'll overly discuss this and we'll have a great relationship by talking about emotions. And what ends up happening is the child then really rebels and pushes away. So, all right. So, like I said, the book isn't necessarily only for individuals with trauma, but that was a really great question that came in. So the next question was, what advice do you have for parents who are working through their grief, anger, or other responses to the way they were parented? Ooh, so this is something that I think that, parents continue to heal from and work through, and it could be through your entire life. Depending on how negatively you were parented, it could take a lot of time to grieve and kind of work through that process. Grief is a really mind-blowing and complex topic. I think society has kind of like tried to dumb it down a little bit, but I use this image, and you can Google it. It's called the grief ball, and it looks like a ball of yarn, and it has so many different emotions that very frequently come up with the concept of grief. So for example, it'll have anxiety, it'll have loneliness, it'll have resentment, frustration, any emotion that you could possibly think of with grief, it's on there. So what I'll have and what I recommend clients do is just look at that ball of grief and try to identify at least 3 or 4 different emotions that you're feeling and where that's coming from for you. What are some past experiences that really bring that up? And how can you just kind of sit with it? You don't have to try and fix it. You don't have to try and make it go away, but just acknowledging it so it doesn't kind of creep in through the back door. And when it creeps in through the back door, it then will often lead us to have really knee-jerk reactions with our children. Same thing with anger. Anger is one of my favorite topics to talk about because I have this belief that there's 4 emotions that lie underneath anger. It's fear, guilt, shame, and embarrassment. And I do talk about these topics in the book a lot more in depth. But what I'll have my parents do is think about, okay, when I'm angry at whatever situation they have, what's being triggered? Is it a fear of I'm not being heard? Is it fear that I'm not a good enough parent? Is it fear that, oh my gosh, my child is always going to be this way? It could be embarrassment. It could be guilt, which often says, I'm doing something bad. And then shame is very similar, and shame will say, I am bad. And so I try and have parents identify what's actually the root feeling in that, and how do we start to heal from that. Again, sitting with it, acknowledging it, and really just being open to, hey, this is an emotion that I have, and that's not bad. There are not bad emotions at all. What we do with the emotions can kind of lead to a not so great direction. But being angry or fearful or hurt, it's not a bad thing to feel. So again, wonderful question. I do see that we're coming up on about 15 minutes. So if you guys have any questions for me, I really encourage you to follow me either on Instagram. My handle is @thefamilytherapist. Feel free to send me some questions, ask me your thoughts, and I would love to hear your thoughts on the book. So again, if you haven't already received your copy, today is launch day. So you can head over to Amazon or Pessy. We have the link right here and pick up your copy today. Like I said, it means a lot to me that you guys are interested in the book and you want to read it, and I really hope that it heals for so many of you. So thanks again for joining me today, and I hope you have an awesome rest of your